Welcome back to the illumilands. My name is Daniel Hurd. In the last episode of Illumilands Responds, I began going over a debate on the Kalam Cosmological Argument between Capturing Christianity, also known as Cameron Bertuzzi, and Rationality Rules, that is, Stephen Woodford. Specifically, in the last episode, I ended by reminding us of the murkiness, whether Cameron's claims are supposed to be metaphysical or epistemological. And because of that murkiness, we basically open up a Pandora's box of complications for the argument. So in this episode, we'll see precisely what that box contains. But before I get into it, I want to remind everyone that these videos are free to watch, which is awesome. But you know what's not free? Making the videos. Also, I might add living. That's why, for those who wish to support the channel and to see my type of videos go on, you can actually go over to my Patreon account and sign up for one of 3 different tiers. I believe the lowest tier is at $4 right now, so it's very cheap just for those who want to really support the channel and see what I do keep going. With that said, let's begin where we left off in the last video.
The relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused is limits.
First and foremost, you might recall that Cameron claimed his argument doesn't rely on a causal principle. And technically speaking, neither premise affirms the truth of a causal principle. But I think it's fair to say that if the support for these premises involves finding a specific relevant difference between what needs a cause and what doesn't, then the argument does depend on a causal principle.
Part of the reason why we think that rocks and branches and people and cars and mountains have causes is because they're limited.
Now, certainly, I've looked at an object and wondered why it is the way it is rather than some other way. There must be an explanation for it. I've certainly felt the weight of contingency requiring an explanation, but I haven't felt the weight of limited things requiring causes in this same way. The fact that a tree is only so tall, or only so heavy, or only has so many leaves, has never seemed to me to imply the tree is caused. Though it has made me wonder why the tree is these ways rather than otherwise. Granted, this is all personal. Maybe you have made this very connection. In that case, Cameron may be more onto something than I'm giving him credit. But as someone who has never felt the weight of this intuition, Cameron's statement that it is intuitively plausible just strikes me as weak. Another way of putting this is that I find the claim limited things require explanations for their limits, something like a principle of sufficient reason. I find that much more intuitive than the claim limited things only exist if they are caused to exist, which is more of a causal principle. For example, imagine there is an unlimited being, and that being voluntarily places limits on itself. The first claim, that's more like a principle of sufficient reason, would just say that the limitation on this being requires some explanation. And indeed, the explanation is something like the voluntary action of the unlimited being. But the latter claim, the causal principle, says the being that used to be unlimited but is now limited, requires a cause. And it requires a cause not only for its specific limitation, but for its entire existence. I find this implication intuitively implausible, and this is why I find a principle of sufficient reason more intuitively plausible than the causal principle discussed here.
In general, limits have causes. There's a reason why my computer right here has a 2 terabyte hard drive instead of a 4 terabyte hard drive. There's a reason that I have the limited amount of power that I have. For example, I haven't been to the gym in a while. Limits, or things that possess limits, have causes.
Again, it's really easy for confusion to arrive here, and I think it has. First, Cameron says,
limits, or things that possess limits,
as though there's no significant difference in this context between limits themselves and things that have limits. But the very next words out of his mouth show why the difference is significant, specifically in this context. And it relates back to what I just said about the difference between an explanation for a limit and a cause of something limited. By bringing up the 2 terabyte versus 4 terabyte example and the limited power example, he's shown we think there are typically explanations why things are as they are instead of otherwise. That is, limits have explanations. But this doesn't show that objects with limits generally require causes for their existence. This confusion also explains something odd that I neglected to go over in the last video. When Cameron lists the 4 candidates for being the relevant difference between caused and uncaused, he ends up asking some really weird questions. When you listen to them, keep in mind the difference between an explanation for a limit and a cause of a limited thing, and see if you catch what I caught.
So let's think about some other potential candidates of something that is a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused. Could it be shape? The shape of a thing. If my phone was the shape of an elephant, would it then be uncaused? No. Let's think about size. What if my phone was suddenly the size of Pluto? Would it then be uncaused? No. No. So shape and size are completely irrelevant when we're thinking about the difference between the caused and the uncaused. What about color? What if I painted my phone white? Would it then be uncaused? No. Now, what about power? This one is a little bit more interesting, but I think we can still see that even if my computer, for example, had an i9 instead of an i7 processor, that wouldn't make it suddenly uncaused. A more powerful computer is not suddenly uncaused in virtue of having more capability. I'm hoping that you're seeing that this question is actually kind of difficult to answer. We can throw out all of these candidates, but they all seem to be irrelevant. My proposal, and this is where we're going to start to see the connection to God, is that the relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused is limits. Part of the reason why we think that rocks and branches and people and cars and mountains have causes is because they're limited in various ways. In general, limits have causes. There's a reason why my computer right here has a 2 terabyte hard drive instead of a 4 terabyte hard drive. There's a reason that I have the limited amount of power that I have. For example, I haven't been to the gym in a while.
Part of the weirdness is that the answers are so obvious. But the obviousness of the answers to Cameron's weird questions is not because it's obvious that limited things require causes. It's obvious because the objects he's talking about are objects we already know to be caused. He's essentially asking whether we've made it such that this caused object didn't have a cause, which is a contradiction.
Alternatively, let's think about something that has no limits. Some atheists will say that an eternal universe doesn't need a cause. An eternal universe has no limit in time. It never began to exist. Removing a limit, in this case, removes the need for a causal explanation of that limit. An infinite universe doesn't need an explanation, so say many atheists. Now, for the record, I don't think that an eternal universe, just in virtue of being eternal, is completely unlimited. It still would seem to have limits in value and in power and maybe even in size and some other different areas. But the point is that a lot of atheists seem to recognize that limits are a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused.
Yes. Many atheists believe that an eternal universe, in virtue of its limitless time, requires no cause. But I don't think this makes the point Cameron wants to make. Why do these atheists believe such a universe requires no cause? It's not because a limit in general was removed. It's because the limit specifically on time was removed. Time, or temporality, no longer factored into the equation. The emphasis is on time, not limits. The reasoning goes something like the following. Premise 1, if something cannot begin to exist, it cannot have a cause. Premise 2, an eternal universe cannot begin to exist. Conclusion, therefore, an eternal universe cannot have a cause. I've also heard people argue in a slightly more complex way to arrive at that same conclusion. Premise 1, no effect can precede its cause in time. Premise 2, in an eternal universe, every time is preceded by a prior time. Premise 3, if something is caused, there is a time during which it is caused. Premise 4, thus, if an eternal universe is caused, there is a time during which it is caused, and a time prior to that at which it exists. Conclusion, therefore, no eternal universe can be caused. Now, whether you agree or disagree with these two arguments, it's undeniable that they are more like the reason some people believe an eternal universe doesn't require a cause. It's not the removal of limits. Granted, some people might simply accept that an eternal universe doesn't need a cause without any further justification. But all that means is that these people have either a different reason for their belief or no reason for their belief. So I don't think appealing to them supports Cameron's argument nearly as much as he thinks, if at all. Cameron notes that an eternal universe might not have a limit on time, but it could still be limited in space, objects, heat, etc. Thus, if he's right that limited things require causes, even an eternal universe would need a cause. I wonder how he'd respond to the two arguments I gave that an eternal universe can't have a cause. I'm not saying I agree with either, but they're at least worthy challenges.
Now, if, in general, limits have causes...
Stop. Notice what he just said. If, in general, limits have causes. Okay, again, does he mean that there needs to be causes for the limits that things have? Or does he mean that there needs to be causes for individual things that have limits? I'll assume he means the latter, but I have to point out what I'm starting to think is an equivocation fallacy.
Now, if, in general, limits have causes, then we have a very powerful reason for thinking that if the first cause has limits, then it has a cause. However, as we saw earlier, the first cause is basically by definition uncaused. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the first cause.
This is true. And it outlines just how central Cameron's causal principle is to his argument, despite his initial comments. If, in general, limited things have causes, then the first cause is probably unlimited. But again, that's if. What reason, apart from intuition, is there to think limited things require causes? Well, even if it isn't the case that
part of the reason why we think that rocks and branches and people and cars and mountains have causes is because they're limited.
It's still pretty easy to show there's a sense in which induction provides some evidence for thinking limited things generally have causes. There are multiple ways we could have experienced the world with regard to this causal principle. We could have examples, but no exceptions, exceptions, but no examples, both exceptions and examples, or neither exceptions nor examples. The first way would clearly support the generality of the causal principle more than any other, and this is precisely the situation we're in. We have examples of limited things being caused, and no examples of limited things existing uncaused. And this is the sense in which induction supports the claim that limited things generally have causes. I'm now also realizing that the same can be said of the inverse claim. That is, in general, caused things are limited. Just as Cameron's causal principle boasts examples and no counterexamples, this limitation principle boasts the same status. This is the sense in which induction supports the claim that caused things generally have limits, and we now have two principles in some way supported by induction. Limited things generally have causes, and caused things generally have limits. The combination of these claims now gives us a new, stronger claim that is also apparently supported by induction. Limited things and causes generally coincide. That is, the lists of caused things and limited things are basically the same list. If something is caused, it is limited. If something is limited, it is caused. This itself implies that being uncaused and being unlimited generally coincide, if there are such beings. The list of uncaused things and unlimited things are also largely identical. These principles, or rather the one sole principle of equivalence between being limited and being caused, this principle seems to lend support beyond the realm of the epistemological second question that Cameron asked. And if you don't quite remember the three questions asked in the last video, here's a reminder. The first question was, why would we not believe a friend who tells us that some random object is uncaused? Okay, that's the first question. The second question was, why do we think limited things have causes? And the third question was, what is it about limited things that requires they have causes? And you'll remember the first two questions are primarily about how we come to know things. It's about our knowledge. The third question, on the other hand, has to do more with metaphysics and what's known as ontology, the nature of being, the nature of what things are like. This equivalence between being limited and being caused seems to go into the realm of metaphysics. Although it doesn't give a reason why limited things and causes generally coincide, it seems to support not only that all limited things happen to be caused, but that there is an explanation why, if something is limited, it requires a cause. Limited things contain something in virtue of which it must be true that they were caused. Similarly, caused things contain something in virtue of which it must be true that they are limited. Now, I know all my listeners at this point who are theists will probably be rejoicing, like, wow, we have even more support for this than Cameron presented. But hang on, we cannot get ahead of ourselves here. Yes, this principle of equivalence between being limited and being caused, if well supported, would give Cameron the resources to make a strong link between being unlimited and being uncaused. And by the way I've been talking, it may seem like we have very good reason to accept this principle. But even though it's technically true that induction supports Cam's causal principle, there is a crucial factor which greatly weakens this support, if not completely diminishing it. We've only ever experienced things that are limited and that have causes. We've never recognized any object as being perfectly unlimited, and we've never recognized any object as existing without a cause. But if our only experience of objects are those we recognize as both limited and caused, then it's no wonder why every limited thing we've seen has also had a cause. It's the same reason every red thing and good thing and tall thing and important thing in our experience has been limited and caused. We've never had the opportunity to survey uncaused and unlimited things and see if any are caused or limited. So the reason every limited thing I've experienced has had a cause could have absolutely nothing to do with any metaphysical connection between limits and causes. Because of this, we can't say it's unlikely there are unlimited things with causes, or uncaused things with limits. And this poses a very big threat to identifying the first cause as specifically God. Again, the problem really isn't so much with there being a first cause. That's fine. What this objection is about is that it's going to make it really hard to identify this uncaused thing with God if it's possible that uncaused things can also be limited. That is the point. The detractor of Cam's Kalam can try weakening the inductive support even further by constructing a parallel argument leading to the conclusion everything that exists has a cause. We only ever experience caused things. Therefore, there are probably only caused things. This conflicts with the idea that a God can exist without a cause. As an inductive argument, this is just like Cameron's argument that every limited thing in experience has been caused. Therefore, probably every limited thing has a cause. But regardless, Cameron already has given us the means to respond to this objection. Remember, his first premise is that there is a first cause, and this implies that not everything has a cause. His support for thinking there is a first cause is itself a defeater of this inductive argument. So any inductive argument that everything has a cause will have to deal with this support first. So Cameron's got a good response against those people who would say, well, probably just everything has a cause. But the detractor of Cam's Kalam can try weakening the argument through yet another line of inductive reasoning. Rather than arguing everything is caused, it could similarly be argued that everything is limited. We only ever experience limited things. Therefore, there are probably only limited things. This argument implies that God, the unlimited being in this argument, probably doesn't exist. Furthermore, Cameron's case for premise 1 has no relevance here. Even though there is positive reason to think something uncaused exists, there just is no positive reason given to think something unlimited exists. Thus, induction supports that there are no unlimited beings, and we have no defeater for this support. This puts the claim that everything is limited on equal footing with the claim that every limited thing has a cause. They both enjoy the same level of support, but one supports Cameron's argument, whereas the other contradicts the argument. The fundamental problem I see facing Cam's Kalam is that we still don't know why the only things we've experienced are limited and caused. Although we have no defeater for thinking the answer involves a fundamental connection between limits and causes, we also don't have much non-intuitive support for thinking this. How could the proponent of Cam's Kalam save the inductive case for thinking that limits require causes? The only significant way I can see is to argue that if caused unlimited beings or limited uncaused beings could exist, we would probably have experiences of such beings. If this is true, then our not having these experiences greatly reduces the likelihood that beings which are caused and unlimited or limited and uncaused can exist. This, in turn, would restore the strength of Cameron's inductive case. But seeing as no argument has been made for this, it remains a moot point, and the detractor of Cam's Kalam is just as reasonable in thinking we wouldn't have experiences of these things even if they could exist. The detractor of Cameron's argument can similarly try bolstering support for thinking everything is limited by arguing that if unlimited beings could exist, we would probably have experiences of such beings. But again, no argument has been made for this, so the mere suggestion poses no threat to Cam's Kalam. And with that, we come to the end of this episode. A lot has been discussed here about Cameron's inductive case for thinking limited things generally require causes. But buckle up, and I mean buckle up, because the next episode involves a discussion of the mind-expanding question: can something completely unlimited rightly be labeled God? So, in the next video, I'll be going over Cameron's reasons for identifying an unlimited being with God. Again, thank you all very much for watching and sticking with it to the end. I know these things can be a bit dense, a bit philosophically heady, but that's really just the territory that we're dealing with. If you like this episode, click the like button and click the subscribe button so you don't miss other videos. And if you really like my videos and you want to support the channel, remember, I have a Patreon and you can sign up for one of the 3 tiers, and the lowest tier is $4. So it's not that expensive and you get to really support what I'm doing, along with, I might add, some really cool perks, some of which are things I have personally made myself that's available to nobody else on the planet except whoever buys that. So yeah, just something to think about. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.